I would like to ask you to please welcome our very own Dave Clark, who will be giving a talk about state machines.
Thank you very much, folks. So, very conscious that for some people this might be the first time that you've even heard about state machines. So, let's see if we can pitch this right. So, just starting off with, can I find out who is new to programming with PHP in general? Ben? There's a few people with their hands up. Okay, that's good to know. In terms of state machines, and how many people have actually heard of state machines? Okay. So this is pretty good. So we've got about half of the folks here who've never heard of them, and half people have. In terms of state machines, for those people who have heard of them, how many have actually implemented them in the software application? Cool. This means there should be some value for the majority of the folks here. Now, in terms of the talk that I was going to do here, I say talk, but it is an introduction to state machines, and specifically for the audience here being mainly PHP developers, I wanted to try and get back to a little bit of the spirit of PHP and community and excitement around the creativity of building something on top of open source libraries. So what I want to do is just do a very quick TLDR on state machines just to frame the session. And then what I'd like to do is actually go into some code examples to help underpin it all. The live coding gods may be with us tonight. Let's see how we go. So thanks a lot. Appreciate you taking the time to come along. I hope you'll enjoy it. And most importantly, I hope that you'll be engaged with it. It's not a community without community. And this session is for you. Let's go. All right. So what we're going to do, we're going to cover off a few things. We're going to talk about what a state machine is, why we'd use one, some practical examples, and also how you can get some hands-on experience doing something similar to what I've done. So what is a state machine? A state machine, quite simply, is a device which stores the status of something at a given time, where status changes are managed based on inputs and previous status. A well-implemented state machine, it should improve the reliability of your software, where you need to update the status of something, and in particular, what it should do is reduce the complexity of the logic that you have in your application. If you can imagine the idea of having to manage something based on a current status and some inputs, probably the things that come to your mind are endless forests of ifs and else, if and else, all the way forever into the Hadouken pattern, all the way down, if this, then that, etc. So, but what are some practical examples? Probably one of the simplest things to think about would be something as simple as a light switch, right? So you've got lights that are on right now. How do we get them to go off? Well, there's probably a few different ways to do that around here because the offices are so swanky and wonderful. But probably there's a switch somewhere, right, that you're going to hit, and it's going to take it from being on to being off. When we talk about state machines, and in particular the example that we're going into tonight, we're going to talk about a finite state machine. Finite state machines are where there is a determined place that something's going to go. Something is in one state and it has a pathway to go into another. There's kind of a direct path. And we'll take a look at it, what a state machine diagram looks like in a moment. Okay, so state machines, as I mentioned, visualized using state machine diagrams and various tools which can be used to create them, and you can even make your own. This is an example of a state machine diagram. What you can see here is that we've got a starting point where something is new, and then based on a transition where it's perhaps being marked as visible. What is this thing, by the way? It's a fictional notification workflow. So if we imagine that there's an object, in this case, maybe something like a notification, think of your email, right? You have an email that comes in and it's unread, and then you can read it, and then you can mark it as unread for some reason. So fairly simple. Let's look at something that's a little bit more complicated. Now, this one here, you hopefully can see it there, but if you can't, I'll just spell it out a little bit. This is a functional purchase order workflow. And let's imagine that somebody, as they might in the PHP community, might get a little bit carried away with their CMS system. They get a little bit carried away and they start doing things that perhaps maybe they shouldn't. Like, I'm just going to make it a shop now. It's going to be a shop that sells everything. And yeah, I'm going to then just, I'm going to start pushing information from my CMS into Xero or something like that, or some crazy ERP system. There are people who will do this. I may at one time have done something similar. But from that point of view, let's imagine that we had something. It's a purchase order that's starting its journey as something new. And then what we want to do is mark it as being awaiting creation in whichever third-party system it is. So it's currently awaiting creation in that system. From there, we can mark it as deleted, in which case it will be deleted. And from there, there's only one path back to awaiting creation in ERP system, which is reopen for creation in the ERP system. From there, it can either be marked as created in the ERP system or nothing, or mark as deleted. You get the idea. There's a finite pathway, right? It's going to end up in one place and there's a transition to get there. So got multiple options, mark it as deleted or mark it as created in the ERP system. When it's deleted, only one way back. And when it's been created, there's no way to delete it, because that's how these things should work. If it's in the ERP and you start deleting things, then you're probably doing something very wrong. Let's have a look and see what we've got on the next slide. Now, this one is almost impossible to read. It's a bit bigger. You're right. So it's at this point in time where I'll take us over to the demo and start to look at this on a browser screen, just to make it a little bit easier. So the power of going between different things clearly with me here tonight, and here it is. All right. So folks, that diagram that we're looking at here, I'm imagining this is a fictional article publishing workflow. So if you start to think about how it might work in a business, like let's say some kind of publishing business. I'm not going to say Finder, even though I have Finder on my top, because we don't actually do this at Finder like this. But I think it's one that people can relate to, right? If you start working on any kind of CMS type project, if there's any kind of complex publishing platform that you're working with, there's usually some people that have to do some kind of thing. Like there'll be people who are dedicated to writing articles, there'll be people who are researchers, and people who are compliance and legal experts, there'll be people who have to sign off and say, yes, this can go live, right? So with that in mind, that's the sort of thing that this is trying to get across, that you can end up with these complicated workflows. So let's just say that we started off and we had a new article in the status of draft new article. From there, we've got a few places that we can go to, right? So we could go to mark it as ready for compliance review. Yeah, seems reasonable. We've written an article. We want to have somebody then go ahead and check whether this thing's okay. We'll check that it's okay before the editor sees it, because the editor, when the editor sees it, wants to go, yeah, this is good to go. I don't want to have to go and talk to somebody in compliance about this. I just want to get the thing live if we're happy that it's good to go. If compliance said yeah, then I'm just checking that it's okay to go out from a brand perspective. So here we are. We can mark it as ready for compliance. What's something else that we could do? Perhaps we want to discard that draft with comments. Now, there could be a few pathways to discard with comments. Let's start from that status and work our way back. Maybe it's ready for compliance review and it's been discarded with comments. Maybe it was ready for editorial review and somebody wants to discard it with comments. There's a few different pathways to get to that status. Is that making sense, folks? Yeah? Awesome. Right. So from there, if something was discarded with comments, where could it go? Ooh, mark as reopened for editing. And from reopen for editing, where does it go? We're chasing it all the way around. Mark as published, says Ben. Mark is ready for compliance review, as every good person should. Then publish. No, we're not going to publish it yet. Marvelous. So you get the idea. There's a fairly big diagram. It's very different to the kind of diagram we were looking at a moment ago when we were talking about notifications or some crazy CMS-based, let's send a purchase order to Xero kind of thing. And what I wanted to do is now just take an opportunity to flip over to some code and talk through a practical example of how you might creatively decide to use some existing open source library that's already out there. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take you on over there, and I'm going to try and make it as easy as possible to see what's on my screen. So if at any point you can't see it, please do shout out. I'm going to go through this step at a time, particularly mindful of the fact that we've got some people who are new to PHP and programming. Some people are new to state machines. But what I want to do is just tell you before I do this, that because I've relied on a convention, I've been able to create through configuration a very easy strategy to be able to generate these documents like this automatically, right? And this is where I start to get really excited about software development in general, right? I love how you can take something that's already giving you something, combine it with something else, and then by following convention, make a process much easier, right? And I hope that's going to be something that inspires you to get a bit creative as well and looking at some open source libraries out there. So rather than gas bagging, I'm going to bring it on up here and talk you through a little bit of what's in this code. I'm going to try and make it a bit bigger so that it's easier to see. And I'm going to start on off at the top. The good news is that we are recording this session, and I'll be making sure that the video is available after this as well, so you'll be able to have a look at it. So, a couple of quick things. Most modern PHP applications out there will end up leveraging a tool called Composer, which is used to manage dependencies. So if you've ever worked with JavaScript, you'll be familiar with things like NPM and Yarn, which are used to install dependencies. Composer is essentially that, but for PHP. And what happens is that when you run Composer, it goes ahead and it maps out the location of all the different files that you want to include in your application and gives you easy ways of doing automatic inclusion of files by creating an autoloader file for you. So in this case here, in this example, I just want to show you what I've done because you can do similar things here as well. All I've done is in the application, I've created a little script that can be run via the CLI, which is essentially an examples file. That's the file that we're in right now. It's just a bog standard PHP file, but the secret sauce right at the beginning is that I'm including this file here. I'm requiring it once. You can see there, vendor autoload. When you use Composer, it will go ahead and install the dependencies and put it into a folder called vendor. And then from there, if you include the vendor autoload file, you're then able to reference all of these classes using the namespaces and so on. So right up at the top of this procedural script, it's a procedural script just to walk you through step by step how you could go about coming up with a creative solution, leveraging an existing open source library, step by step, building up how you can work with a state machine. And we'll go through more of that in just a moment. So right here, what you're seeing between lines 5 and 13, we've got some use statements, which are essentially saying these are the classes that we want to import here. If you're more familiar with Java, it's kind of like, import statements, etc. And what I've done is just added some comments up at the top to frame what we're going to look at. So just when I'm looking at it here, again, just to remind you, the purpose of this is to demonstrate creative uses of an existing library. In this particular case, I'm going to show you a layer, how you might create a layer for managing transitions based on a user and their role. And we're going to highlight the value of convention to support automation. And the example that I was giving you was that, documentation can be created on the fly programmatically. So we're going to have a look at some code now, which is all about setting up the state machine and also the object, which we're going to control the status transitions for via the state machine. So looking at this here, you can see I'm getting a variable config path, and I'm using the real path function that comes with PHP in order to get a fully qualified path to a particular location. And the reason that I'm doing it this way as well, folks, just to let you know, I'm using Docker for this example. How many people are familiar with and work with Docker every day? Okay, it's cool. There's about half the room, right? So half the room might be new to it, right? So just to say that the way this is working is the application, I've got it running inside of a Docker container. And that means that if I was going to be referencing a very particular file path here all the way, then it probably would break my code, right? Because what would be happening is it'd be trying to run some program inside of a container, which has a different file system inside of it versus what I have in my local system. What I actually want to do when I run this script is to get onto the command line and actually get into the command line inside of the Docker container. And I'm doing that in this case by running the docker exec function and using the -it options, the name of the container, space, and then the thing that I want to execute. In this case, I built the Docker container using an Alpine image. So that means it's quite a small Docker image. And instead of bash being the command that I would run on the likes of that, I'm going to run sh because that's essentially the equivalent for the Alpine one. So I go ahead and I run that, and now I'm actually going directly into the container. So when we see /var /www on that command line down at the very bottom left there, that might be a bit tricky to read. So that is inside of the file system within that container. Okay. So from there, I'm going to go into a folder that's called finite state machine and examples. And if I flip back over to the code, that's actually the file that you see in here. It's inside of that folder. It's called rbac-state-transitions.php. So this, when I'm running that real path function, it's going to be executed inside of the container, and it will be getting the path of the /var /www. Okay, just so everybody's aware of what that's doing there. And then from there, I'm using components from the finite library, and I'm just going to call that out just now, because this was all made possible by hacking creatively with fun in mind on top of that library. So I'm just going to bring that up on the screen so you can see it. So it's this one here. So finite. So I ended up installing that via Composer, the tool I was talking about before. And then what I did was I went ahead and built a few classes to wrap the functionality of that state machine library. Now, one of the first things that we're going to do here, we're going to instantiate something called an array loader. And it is going to use an object configuration, which I'll show you in just a moment in another screen. So this object, the whole point of it is that it's going to actually take some configuration information coming in, and it's going to be providing that to the state machine object. And we'll see that shortly. It seems a little bit clunky at first when you're looking at this stuff, but it should make a little bit more sense in a moment after seeing this. So you can see that we're trying to use that config path, and we're trying to find some article.php file. Well, what is that? Let's take a look, right? Now, this is pretty much what it looks like. I'm making it a little bit bigger so it should be easier to see. Essentially got a big array here, and you can see the structure of it. We've got some values with their keys here. So we've got key of class and then a fully qualified class name. I've got a workflow name here, and it says fictional publishing workflow for an article. That might be ringing some bells here, folks, when we flip on back over to the diagram and look at the top. We've got a fictional publishing workflow for an article. You can possibly see already where the power of configuration comes into generating documentation automatically. Hey, if I wanted to add something else in here, probably all I need to do is add an extra index and a value into that array, and I can use that configuration to do something else in here. That's the sort of thing that I'm hoping is going to start going through your mind, start feeling a little bit excited about what you might be able to do with this kind of stuff, right? So moving on down, we can see that there's an array index of states. And here we've got a variety of states that might look a little bit confusing, right? What's going on here? Why is there some kind of separator here between the word open and then draft_new article? Let's take a moment and have a look at that diagram again, right? So you got draft new article. Let's get a little bit closer here. Okay. So you can see draft new article. Do you see that there's a very big similarity between that and what you see here? The only difference here is that there's no underscores in that diagram, and there's a capital D at the beginning, right? Again, one of the wonders of favoring a particular configuration approach, right? You can use a naming convention and then have some tool just go over it and strip out the underscores. You can make sure that you uppercase first at the very beginning of a string, and then you've got something that looks human readable. So as we know, there's all manner of levels of abstraction that we can get to, but there's something wonderful about just being able to look at something for it to make sense. And this is where, as an engineer, I tend to favor very pragmatic solutions and actually quite like the idea of something concrete. So in this case here, you can see that there's a configuration format. All I'm going to do is tell you this very quickly. The reason that I've used a separator here is because in my design here, I like the idea of separating the idea of a status and the idea of a status reason. I like the idea that something can be open with a status reason, right? I like the idea that I could then have an alternative filtering approach when I go searching for things. Let's imagine we're building our own Jira, right? We want to rebuild Jira. You want to rebuild a tool like that. You've got workflows. You can say, okay, well, I want to be able to query all the open tickets right now. I want to query all the closed ones. I want to see all the closed ones with statuses in, like status reason in these view. There's all manner of flexibility that you opened up in various transitions. In this model, what I've done is something similar with the transitions. What I've said is that these transitions are things that you want to do to an object, right? You want to mark something as ready for compliance to review it. You want to mark something as ready for editorial review. You want to mark something as needs some changes. It's like anything that you can think of is a thing that needs to be done. You can put it in here inside of the transitions. And something, when it's a transition, can go from somewhere to something else, right? And it's an array of things that it can go from, but only one thing it can go to. So it can go from many different states, but just to one finite state. So that's what's been done in this case. That's the configuration. If we quickly go back to the example, what I've done is I've made it so that it loads the configuration. And then from there, we instantiate an object, which will be the thing that will be managed through that journey. It starts off with a status of open and a status reason of draft new article. If we looked at get finite state, it would be giving you the open code with the separator and then draft new article. We instantiate a state machine object. We pass it the article. We use the loader and we load the state machine with all of the information that was configured in the loader. And then from there, we initialize the state machine and we try and capture any exceptions there just for the sake of this example. Let's move on. This is where we start to play with a user in this example. We create a user class and we can provide some properties for it. And then from there, get onto the idea of some roles. A user is nothing without their role. It shouldn't be users that have permissions, it's roles that should have permissions. And that's the whole idea behind role-based access control. So in this case here, I've created some role-based access control classes. And the idea is that we have one that really matters, which is the workflow role. We assign it permissions and a role name. And then from there, we can do things like, let's actually say there's specific things that we want to allow them to do. So if we were to define this with an expectation of behavior, we'd say, given I'm logged in and my role type is workflow role, and the role name is article writer, then I expect I can initiate transition, mark as ready for compliance review. That might be the one thing that I'm allowed to do, the one transition I can do. So anyway, in that case there, let's imagine that we're going to go ahead and do this. We instantiate the workflow role. We assign that to the user. By default, if I didn't configure the workflow role to have a role name and some permissions, then it would be a guest with absolutely no permission. And if I went ahead, I might create some kind of object like a user-aware state transition broker. Right? Wow, where did that name come from? Where's Dave Newson? He'd love that one. So yeah, that sounds a bit Java-like, doesn't it? So user-aware state transition broker. This object, its responsibility is to go ahead and take the user, a particular object that would be under control of the state machine, work out what are the possible transitions, and then actually allow the transition to happen based on the relevant inputs. So I'm going to skip forward a little bit. And let's imagine that we're in a situation where we wanted to determine the possible transitions based on this script. If I went ahead and ran this directly on the command line, I can do that just now, just by trying to execute that example. We'll see the love of var dump. We can see that because I didn't configure the role, there's a workflow role object here with the role name guest, and there's no permissions, no evil CRUD ever. And we've got some workflow permissions here. Now, the object that's controlled by the state machine is the article. It was in a particular state, and we can see that there's no possible transitions that that user can make. If we were to quickly change this around and make it so that we have an article writer permission set, and then execute it again, we should find that there's an alternative outcome, right? We should find that we've got somebody who then has this permission for the workflow of mark as ready for compliance review, and the possible transition based on the current object state is that it can be marked as ready for compliance review. If that was an article editor, it wouldn't be able to do that. And I hope that this has started to whet your appetite for a little bit of excitement with building out some applications of your own. In this case here, my other method that I'd add into something like the user-aware state transition broker would be something along the lines of, let's go ahead and transition or fail. Okay, so that's an idea. You might have illegal transitions and unauthorized transitions. You can use exception handling in order to capture that and think about how you want to report the errors in your system and make for a better user experience. I hope you've enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun making it. Cheers. Thank you. Yeah, sure. I think we do have some time for questions. Anybody got a question? Anything they want to share about state machines, good or bad, experiences you may have had? Jesse, do you want to come on up? What's that mean? You know what, in this case, that's a good question. The question was, do we use cookies and sessions in order to manage the state? In this particular case, I would actually be looking to not use sessions at all. The idea behind this is, like, I suppose if we imagine the enterprise API scenario that we had earlier on, let's imagine that somebody was trying to do something. Someone has sent a request to a particular endpoint. We can probably determine some things about where has that request come from. There's probably like an API key that's being used in order to invoke a particular event. And based on that, we can determine that was the user, this was the object that we were working with. So therefore, we actually don't really care about anything other than an event happened and that something's going to grab that event and do something with it later on. So the idea is to reduce any kind of front end, back end dependency and really try and make the system as flexible as it can be while remaining pragmatic. So in this case, I envisage that this kind of approach would lend itself well to having a UI where you can actually go out and build your own workflows. You might want to have a UI that's responsible just for managing the configuration. Drag and drop, maybe even the UI looks a little something like this, but much more beautiful, right? And you can move things around and you can say, well, I want this to happen, I want that to happen. And then you worry about who can actually do these things. So you can actually build quite an interesting and intricate set of permissions and transitions that relate back to them in the overall workflow. So that's the idea. Try and minimize any usage of cookies and sessions for anything. Try and make it something that could run anywhere. Cool. Any other questions, folks? Jermaine?
There's some library to generate this diagram from.
If you don't mind, very quickly, I'll show you what I did. It's super hacky, but I think you'll enjoy it. From the it's called what? Mate. Paint. MS Paint. Until hook, line, and sinker there, Sada. Thank you for that. That's a good one. I didn't use Paint, actually, for this one, but I did use a little. I know you can hardly tell, right? I used GraphViz. I don't know if you're familiar with GraphViz, but what I'll do is I'll show you very quickly what I ended up doing. For anybody who's new to it, I'll actually just show you very quickly. If you're using a Mac, it's as simple as going ahead and saying brew install GraphViz, right? And when you install GraphViz, then you can see like you won't have the error that I got, right? The error that I got here was that a command called dot doesn't exist. You can use the dot command when you've got GraphViz installed in order to be able to go ahead and work with whatever you like to create these. If you've got dot files that have been formatted correctly, you can use dot to convert them into PNGs, into SVGs. And I'll show you very quickly the horrible hacky thing that I did, time permitting. Let's have a look right now and I'll show you. So what I did was I thought to myself, it'll be great to showcase something like a quick tool that you can use yourself in order to do this just based on those configuration files that we saw earlier on. So what I ended up doing was just creating a little folder called tools, and inside of there what I did was I came up with a generate state diagrams file. Now this is going to look horrible to a lot of people, but I'll tell you what, it didn't take long to write and it gave me a lot of scalable savings of time in terms of the benefit. So let's look and see what we actually do. We end up going ahead and working out some formatting for things about what a dot file should actually look like in the end. If you've got an example of a dot file that you want to emulate in terms of, hey, I really like the way that style looks, I love the way that fits together on the screen, you can actually start with that as a template. Go, how can I recreate that? Because I know what the syntax looks like in the dot file, let's start by trying to recreate the syntax of that one that we really liked using this kind of approach with a scrappy, crappy procedural PHP script in this case. So what this did was it went over the configuration file, iterated over the information in it, and essentially gave us some dot files. Now I've got some folders. I've got folders here, this one called docs, and inside of this, I've got an example of that. I'll use the notifications one, okay? So the notifications one was fairly simple, and I'm going to make it a little bit bigger so you can see it. So that's an example of the dot file format. I'll make it a little bit bigger so you can see the start of it. Okay, so as an example of what it looks like, okay? And the thing is, it went through the configuration and simply just used the approach to build an output like this, which then dot could be used to create those diagrams. So keep it super simple, and the idea is that it can be something that you can make a simple script to execute on a build with. Hey, mate.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Hey guys, fantastic presentation. I guess the next time we're writing any database application and we want to just update the status of a record, try that. That's awesome. The other thing is that the Symfony component comes out. It's actually called the workflow component, and it's a fully functional state machine where it allows you to generate that diagram from a simple console command. You could literally just do bin console, and it allows you to define your state machine in YAMLs. So you could even do that. You just define it there, have a visual idea, and debug through. And because it's a Symfony component, you don't really need the bundle approach either. You could use it in any library as well. So give that a go as well. It's a pretty cool way to update your states.
That's a great shout out. And from that point of view, there'll be lots of people who probably have great tips like that as well. Please, let's share them. Let's make sure we get them into the Meetup channel. I'm going to say that for state machines, if you're new to them, as I said, there's some excellent series from MATLAB and places like that where they take you through the ins and outs. They give you the history about where they started and all the different varieties of them. I'm very happy that I've had the chance to share that with you. Very grateful for your time. And yeah, let's keep this thing going. Cheers. Thank you.